This year came dreadful forewarnings over the land of the Northumbrians, terrifying the people most woefully. These were immense sheets of light rushing through the air, and whirlwinds and fiery dragons flying across the sky. These tremendous tokens were soon followed by a great famine, and not long after, on the 6th day before the Ides of January in the same year, the harrowing inroads of heathen men made lamentable havoc in the Church of God in Holy Island by rapine and slaughter.
So read in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles the entry for the year 793 AD. Recorded here was the murder of defenceless monks and the plundering of St. Aidan's revered monastery of Lindisfarne. Pagan warships had fallen upon the island without warning, committing atrocities that appalled the Christians of Northumbria. But it was more than this that the Chronicles recorded. It was the emergence of a new threat to the beleaguered kingdoms of Dark Age Europe, one that had come to terrorize, rob, and kill their peoples. It was the beginning of a new age, the age of the Vikings. Why the Vikings burst upon the scene at the end of the 8th century in such violent and sudden fashion can never be wholly explained. Even the origin of the name Viking is obscure, and its meaning can be ambiguous. Vikings were defined less by where they came from than by how they behaved. Vikings came from Scandinavian countries, but not everyone from Scandinavia was a Viking. A Viking was distinguished by his actions, and the most visible of these was piracy and raiding. But exploration, colonization, and trading were to be just as central to the Viking ethos.
It's difficult to find single explanations that explain the Viking Age. Certainly medieval writers talked about overpopulation in Scandinavia, land shortage, and Icelanders, for example, thought that their ancestors had left Norway because of the tyranny of the Norwegian king Harald Finehair. Monastic writers thought that it was God's punishment on the sinful people of Western Europe.
It could be that the population is expanding, and it could be that people are therefore, or at the same time, aware that there is somewhere else to go and live, and that it's possible for them to do this. There's also connections with trade. None of these are really conclusive. The most important one, I suppose, really is their seeking loot. The fact that there are these important people in Scandinavia who are warriors, essentially, or are kings, and they are trying to get hold of goods which they can then use themselves to reward their followers when they go home. However, clearly that's not the only thing which is going on, because there's also a whole series of, if you like, peasant migrations which follow on behind this.
By the 8th century, the Vikings possessed the technology to hit foreign coastlines hard and fast, almost with impunity. The Viking longboat has become an almost mythical weapon of war. With their sleek lines and high prows, decorated in pagan imagery including the famous dragon's heads, the Viking longboat is unmistakable. In open sea, it sailed under the power of a single large square sail. Upriver, it was powered by anything between 26 and 70 oars, depending on the size of the vessel. Most longboats, usually made from oak, ranged from 60 to 90 feet in length, although the Viking Age would witness some giants, such as Long Serpent, the flagship of the Viking king Olaf Tryggvason, and Great Dragon, the flagship of the legendary Harald Hardrada.
The Viking longships were different because they could actually cross open sea, and this opened up a sort of huge area of ocean that previously hadn't been open. Most other vessels had to hug the coastline, so the ocean-going ship was a big advantage. Also, they had relatively shallow drafts, so they could beach very easily. They could travel in fairly shallow waters as well as across the ocean, so they were very versatile.
People in Scandinavia had always been using boats. Boats have been increasingly developed and become better and better from going on sea voyages over a long period of time. In the 9th century, you can see from Scandinavian boat burials that all of a sudden the boats seem to be getting significantly larger, I think. In particular, there are two well-known boat burials amongst them, one at Oseberg in Norway and Gokstad as well. Both of these boat burials have extremely large boats with an extremely broad hull, and again they have what we might call a very shallow draft. So you can see that these boats were designed to go in rivers as well as on the sea.
This mobility, both on the rivers and on the sea, gave Viking raiders the advantage upon which they absolutely depended: surprise. In the decade following the attack on Lindisfarne in 793, the Vikings returned to hit targets on the coastlines of the British Isles and the continent again and again. St. Columba's monastery on the island of Iona was attacked in 795, 802, and again in 806. Communities on the islands of Scotland and in the Hebrides, Shetlands, and Orkneys were particularly vulnerable. In 795, the first recorded attack was made upon Ireland, probably at Raitlin Island. Raids on the monasteries at Inishmurray and Inishbofin soon followed. The Welsh kingdoms suffered too, and monasteries at Carmarthen, Llancarvan, St David's and Llanwit were all attacked. Before the end of the 8th century, attacks were also recorded against the northern coastlines of the Carolingian Empire. By the scale of what was to follow, these early raids might be called sporadic, but for coastal communities in particular, it was an unnerving time.
Well, what the Vikings were after was loot. The Vikings wanted money, they wanted riches, and what they were going to do was take those riches back home, back to Denmark or Norway or wherever they were going, to invest in their own projects at home. So they wanted money. And the thing that you have to remember about Western Europe and Western Christendom in general is that a large amount of wealth is actually focused in the monasteries. Monasteries are private foundations. They're founded by princes, by kings, sometimes by bishops. They're founded by the great aristocrats. They cost an enormous amount of money, and so these monasteries are the focus of a great deal of loot. They're the focus of large numbers of economic resources, things like cattle, for example, or sheep. So you have the lower orders, which you can use for slaves. You can sell them in the slave market. You can take them home and use them as slaves yourself. The cattle you can take away and use yourself or sell on yourself. And the people, the rich people, you take away and you ransom them. And monasteries are these wonderful, isolated outposts of wealth in Western Christendom.
Always, the Viking raids were rapid and ferocious. But they were probably not usually the bloodbaths of popular imagination. These early Viking raids were made by just a handful of longboats, with a total complement of a couple of hundred fighting men at most. They relied on speed, surprise, and terror to get what they wanted. The longboats would appear with little warning, and bands of heavily armed men would quickly descend upon the local communities. Typically, the locals would flee or seek some kind of arrangement with the Vikings that might save their lives, but little of their property. But if resistance was offered, the Vikings were quite capable of living up to their stereotype. In making an example of the brave, a raiding party might slaughter an entire village and burn it to the ground. When word spread of the atrocity, other villagers would take the lesson to heart. In the middle of the 9th century, Viking raids reached unprecedented levels. Viking fleets of up to 60 ships now prowled the coastlines of Western Europe, and attacks were made with greater force and confidence.
The most obvious reason for Viking raiding to intensify in the 830s, I think, is the fact that the Vikings now are aware of what's going on in Western Europe. They understand, for example, that there is civil war in the Frankish Empire. You see increasing amounts of kings' time spent trying to repel these raiders, increasing amounts of time trying to mobilise forces to try and get these people pushed out because the raiders are going further and further inland.
The Carolingian Empire, bereft of Charlemagne's leadership since his death in 814, was amongst those that felt the brunt of this new Viking onslaught. The empire was savaged by heavy raiding up the Seine Valley, against Rouen and Paris. In the Loire Valley, Nantes, Tours, Blois and Orléans were all attacked. So too was Bordeaux on the Garonne. Paris itself was attacked 3 times within 16 years. In 858, Vikings even captured the abbot of Saint-Denis, whom they ransomed back to Paris for an agreeable sum of gold. Further east, the coastlands of Frisia were subjected to the same terrors. Hamburg, Kentovik, and Dorestad all suffered blood and fire at the hands of Vikings.
In Carolingian Europe, there was conflict at this time between the sons of the emperor, and therefore the sons were unable to actually put up a united defence against the Vikings. The Vikings could actually exploit these divisions in local politics. We know, for example, that the Carolingians actually used the Viking armies as mercenaries too. So the intensification can partly be explained by conditions in the actual countries where the Vikings attacked. It also seems in the British Isles, for example, that the Vikings had probably established some kind of base in the Orkneys, the Hebrides, and this meant that it was actually easier for them to attack other parts of the British Isles too. So therefore there were more attacks.
In England, the Chronicles record a stream of attacks against the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, with Kent particularly hard hit. In 839 alone, London, Rochester and Canterbury were all sacked by Vikings. In a score of skirmishes and small but bloody battles against the invaders, Anglo-Saxon armies won some notable victories. But just as often, local levies were cut to pieces or scattered by the Viking attack. In 843, the Vikings established a permanent base for themselves at Noirmoutier, a small island in the vastness of the Loire estuary. Until such bases were established, raiding had been predominantly a summer activity, and the longboats would return home for the stormy winter months. Now, Viking raiding was an all-year hazard for the people of the Loire Valley.
Suddenly the Vikings become a year-round menace, that up until that point the Vikings went home. They went home to Scandinavia, and for that time at least what you had was peace. And then you knew that when the days started getting longer, the nights shorter, that the Viking longships would appear again. When they start to overwinter, that's when you have a year-round problem.
They're not simply there for loot, they're there potentially for political conquest, and it shows they're really very, very confident about what they're doing as well. And that's something which perhaps we couldn't always have said beforehand. But certainly by the 840s and the 850s, when they're staying in England, they're staying in the Carolingian Empire, this really shows that they mean serious business and they're not just raiding.
The Vikings chanced their arm further afield. In 844, the Moors got their first taste of Viking violence when Seville was attacked. The Moors' name for these intruders was heathen wizards. The attack on Seville was beaten off, but in 859, 2 Viking pirates operating in the Loire joined forces in an ambitious plan to sack Rome. The longboats of Bjorn Ironside and Halstein combined to form an impressive fleet of 62 ships. Passing through the Straits of Gibraltar, the Vikings wintered in the Rhone Delta. The next summer, Pisans were stunned by Viking raiders descending on their town after a sea voyage of over 3,000 miles. The Vikings may have been in a class of their own as navigators, but in other respects their geography left something to be desired. It was Luna that received the wrath intended for Rome, and the Vikings were on their way home before they discovered the error. Principally, the Vikings that tormented Western Europe were from Denmark and Norway. Sweden had its own Vikings, but they had turned east. Using the epic lengths of the Volga and Dnieper rivers, the Vikings penetrated into the heart of Russia and beyond. In the first recorded Viking act in that part of the world, in 852, the people of Novgorod paid money to Swedish Vikings to leave them in peace. This form of blackmail money would have been depressingly familiar to the people of the West. In 858, the Vikings even had the audacity to launch a raid against Constantinople, by some distance the largest city in Europe. The Vikings themselves simply called it Miklagarth, the Great Town. The expedition set off from Kiev, rowing the length of the Dnieper to reach the Black Sea, but Constantinople proved too tough a nut to crack. Raids against extremities of the Byzantine Empire proved more rewarding. Swedish Vikings particularly were talented merchants, and their eastern voyages brought them into contact with equally entrepreneurial characters from the Orient. In markets from the mouth of the Volga to Jerusalem, they traded for silks and spices from as far as India and China. Within a century, the Vikings, in the midst of a Slavic population, had faded from view as a distinct group. It was a process of assimilation that was to characterize Viking colonies across Europe. But they had made sufficient impression on the Byzantine Emperor for him to form a personal guard from Viking mercenaries. This became one of history's most famous elite fighting units, the Varangian Guard.
it was exclusively composed of Scandinavian mercenary warriors, an elite bodyguard. They were the highest paid of all the emperor's troops.
It seems that the reason for the Byzantine Empire having these forces is because they were renowned for their fighting skills, and also, I suspect, because they were regarded as being perhaps more faithful and less involved in Byzantine politics, possibly. We know that even by about 945 there was a treaty set up which enabled, or whereby the Byzantine Emperor specifically requested to have these troops sent to him. So you can see that by perhaps 50 or 75 years after this empire first really took root, the Byzantines really respected the Scandinavian fighters.
But of all the lands to suffer at the hands of Viking raiders, it was the British Isles that were to endure the worst. As raids intensified in the course of the 9th century against islands that were politically divided and at war with themselves, conquest and colonisation were added to the Viking agenda. In 839 in Ireland, Vikings had wintered near Lough Neagh. Under the legendary Viking leader Turgus, the Vikings went on to establish a base at Dublin 2 years later. Other settlements followed, at Waterford, Wexford, Wicklow, Cork and Limerick. Years later, Turgus himself was killed by the Irish, drowned in Lough Neagh. And as the native population fought back, Viking contingents from Norway and Sweden fought amongst themselves. The Vikings in Ireland would go on to successfully integrate themselves politically, economically and culturally, so that even after the Kingdom of Dublin's crushing defeat at Clontarf in 1014, their influence was still felt. In historic tradition, Anglo-Saxon England is described as a heptarchy, that is, a country of 7 kingdoms. Kent, Sussex, Essex, Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia and Northumbria. This was always a simplification, and in the middle of the 9th century, very far from fact. Wessex was now the kingdom on the rise, after a period of Mercian dominance under King Offa. In 853, the Chronicles record an Anglo-Saxon assault upon the Viking base on the Isle of Thanet.
The same year, also, Elcher with the men of Kent and Huda with the men of Surrey fought in the Isle of Thanet with the heathen army, and soon obtained the victory. But there were many men slain and drowned on either hand, and both the aldermen killed.
Pitched battles are very rare, and the Vikings try and avoid these wherever possible. Of course they do, and it's very difficult for an Anglo-Saxon king to come along and to create a situation where you can have a pitched battle against the Vikings. Because by the time they've arrived, they've got the loot, they go, you've called up your army, the Vikings have gone. When you do actually manage to corner them, they fight in a very similar way to the warrior aristocracies of Western Christendom. They wear the same sort of equipment, the Frankish sword, the Frankish javelin. There is the battle axe, but the Anglo-Saxon warriors use battle axe too. So they look the same, they dress the same, they fight with the shield war in very much the same way.
In 865, a traumatic chapter began in the history of Anglo-Saxon England. In East Anglia, the chronicles talk of the landing of a Danish host that came to be known as the Great Army. Estimates of the army's size vary massively. 3,000 men is amongst the more credible suggestions. Amongst this army's leadership were 4 sons of the legendary Viking leader Ragnar Lodbrok.
Ragnar Lothbrok, or Ragnar Shaggy Breeches, is first mentioned in a 11th century account of the Dukes of Normandy, mentioned very briefly. The fullest information we've got for him is from a 13th century Icelandic saga, the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, and this is where the story of his death comes from.
He meets his death in a pit of snakes, captured by King Ella of Northumbria. Unfortunately for King Ella, he was to die very, very shortly afterwards at the hands of a couple of Vikings who were supposedly Ragnar's sons. Now, the saga makes out that this is an act of revenge, and it makes this definite genealogical link between Ragnar and his sons, but in the earlier sources this isn't really very clear at all.
It basically seems as though the story is an entire fabrication. We know that the sons of Ragnar, Ivar the Boneless, Björn and Sigurd, were historical figures, but the figure of Ragnar Lothbrok himself seems to be literary invention.
After camping in East Anglia, which the great army spared in return for the payment of gold, they travelled north into Northumbria. Northumbria, once itself the dominant kingdom in England, had been the first victim of the Vikings in 793. Now, racked by bitter internal feuds, she fought desperately for survival, but in vain. York was captured and the kingdom overrun. If the stories are to be believed, Iella, king of Northumbria, was killed. As revenge for the death of Ragnar Lodbrok, he was subjected to the horrific Blood Eagle death.
The rite of the Blood Eagle supposedly involves the Vikings killing their enemy by cutting away their ribs all the way down from the top all the way to the bottom, removing the ribs on both sides of the spine, and then removing their lungs, and then offering these lungs as a sacrifice to the god Odin. Again, whether this is myth or whether this is indeed reality is very unclear, because our best source for this, rather like the myth of Ragnar Lothbrok, comes from a much later saga, Orkney Inga saga, which was written down 200, 300, possibly 400 years after the events it supposedly depicts.
After the conquest of Northumbria, the Danish army turned its attentions towards Mercia. But Wessex and Mercia had joined forces to face this new threat. And after heavy fighting around Nottingham, and probably the payment of gold, the Vikings returned to York. In 870, the great army returned to East Anglia. This time, King Edmund met them in battle at Hawkson. For Edmund, it was a disaster, with only the consolation that his awful death at the hands of pagans would lead to sainthood. The following year, the Viking army advanced into Wessex as far as Reading. In the depths of winter, the King of Wessex led an army to challenge them, and was victorious in the grueling Battle of Ashdown. But shortly afterwards, the king was dead, and the leadership of Wessex fell to his younger brother, Alfred. Fighting a reinforced Viking army at Wilton, Alfred was defeated. But with gold, the Vikings were persuaded to withdraw to winter quarters in London. The Danes spent the next few years roaming the length and breadth of the country at will, consolidating their conquests, suppressing Anglo-Saxon revolts, and exacting tribute from the surviving kingdoms of Mercia and Wessex. Vikings settled in the conquered kingdom of Northumbria, and after the expulsion of King Burgrud of Mercia, his helpless successors watched Vikings claim and settle the eastern part of the kingdom. Wessex alone avoided these ignominious fates. But in 878, a Viking army descended suddenly from Gloucester in the midst of winter, catching King Alfred completely unawares. Those of his forces that Alfred could muster in time for battle at Chippenham were scattered or destroyed by the Viking army of Guthrum. Alfred himself became a fugitive, withdrawing into the Somerset marshes. In a remarkable epic of survival and perseverance, Alfred raised fresh forces to confront the Vikings at Edington and won a decisive victory. Alfred became the first Anglo-Saxon king to dictate peace terms to the heathen invaders. The subsequent treaty established what has come to be known as the Danelaw, a swathe of England on the far side of Watling Street, of which Viking conquest was recognised. As part of the settlement, Guthrum himself was baptised a Christian.
Well, the relationship of the Vikings to Christianity is not straightforward. You can't talk about the Vikings as one homogeneous group. That as individuals, they had different responses to Christianity. I think what's striking about the Vikings is their willingness to take on Christianity when they move into a new area. It's very clear, for example, that in Anglo-Saxon England, the Vikings are taking. Okay, they don't like monasticism, and they don't really take to monasticism. But Christianity, in general, seems to thrive under the Vikings in the 10th century in East Anglia, for example.
The reasons for conversion often seem to have been political. Guthrum, we know, converted to Christianity as part of a peace treaty that he signed with Alfred the Great, and his followers were converted as part of this peace treaty too. Harold Bluetooth, King of Denmark, probably converted because he was threatened by his German neighbours who were going to launch a crusade against their pagan northern neighbour if they weren't converted. So therefore there were often very good political reasons to convert to Christianity.
The establishment of the Danelaw did little to bring peace. Fresh Viking incursions and raids kept Alfred at war for the rest of his reign. But amongst Alfred's many remarkable achievements were military reforms that would be the basis of Anglo-Saxon reconquest. They included the creation of a fleet, the reorganisation of the peasant levy to provide a permanent army, and the establishment of fortified towns called burhs. These all helped Alfred the Great's successors to reconquer England over several decades. The last Viking king of York, Eric Bloodaxe, was killed at Stainmore in 954. By the reign of Edgar 5 years later, the kings of Wessex were effectively kings of a united England.
During the settlement of the Danelaw in the 9th century, various different armies had settled and divided up the land, and it seems that after they'd settled there was a good deal of fragmentation, if you like. They didn't keep up their links, they intermarried with locals and so on. On top of that, in the 10th century, you've got another Viking conquest launched from Dublin, who imposed their kingship on the inhabitants of Yorkshire. And we know from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that the Danes and the Norwegians didn't get on. There was conflict between them. So therefore, when it came to reconquering the Danelaw, the English kings faced a divided enemy, and they were able to exploit that.
If you look at the charter evidence, the reality is that what's happening is that there's some sense in which these West Saxon kings are buying into this new territory. We have other evidence which shows Viking jarls being involved in West Saxon armies. Viking jarls are there in the army that goes north with Athelstan to York in the 930s. So what do we mean by reconquest of the Danelaw? What is actually happening is we have an expansion of the West Saxon kingdom, which is very often to the advantage of those jarls who come under its control.
In France, native princes also mounted effective counterattacks, helped by the growing role of heavily armoured feudal cavalry. But the Vikings were far from a spent force. When they returned with a vengeance, in the unhappy reign of King Ethelred. Shortly after his reign began in 979, Ethelred faced a new kind of threat from Scandinavia, Sven Forkbeard, the King of Denmark. He was supported by the raids of several Viking chieftains, operating more or less independently of the Danish king. One such chieftain was Olaf Tryggvason. The situation reached crisis point when disaster overtook the English at the Battle of Maldon.
The Battle of Maldon took place in 991. This is recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and one or two other brief references to it. But our main source is a much later poem which seems to record a story which was possibly recorded orally, possibly comes from other written sources, and was written down much later. Many of the names in the poem probably didn't mean very much to people even a few decades or a generation or two after the poem was written, because it's almost like a commemorative poem, recording the names of particular people and what they did at this battle. Some of them are portrayed as being loyal and supporting their leader, and some of them are portrayed as being cowards.
The epic poem of the battle doubtless gives a romanticised picture of courageous but doomed English resistance, but some interesting historical details do emerge. After attacks on Folkestone, Sandwich and Ipswich in 991, the Viking fleet of Olaf Tryggvason had encamped on Northey Island, east of Maldon. There they were confronted by an English army commanded by the Ealdorman of Essex, Britnoth. Northey Island was, and still is, an island just so long as the tide is high. When the tide recedes, a causeway to the island is revealed. The first clash was verbal. Britnoth sneered at the Viking threats shouted across the water and their offer to leave peacefully in exchange for gold. A desultory exchange of arrow fire began, but no real harm could be done whilst the tide was high. When it receded, the Vikings poured down the causeway. But in unconscious imitation of Horatius defending Rome, 3 English champions held the land bridge against all comers. It appeared that the two armies would be spared a pitched battle. Then, in a move which at first appears incredible, Britnoth accepted the Viking request to cross the causeway unmolested.
The poem tells us it was offermod, overconfidence. In many ways, the Battle of Maldon, the poem of the Battle of Maldon, is a classic tragedy. What we have is somebody who has a characteristic which in most circumstances is something to be applauded. Overconfidence is something that's to be applauded in an Anglo-Saxon ealdorman. He's got to look the part, he's got to be the part, and that means being what we might describe as being arrogant. And that overconfidence, that offermod, is good. But in this particular instance, it brings about his downfall, and that's the tragedy according to the poet.
Under the furious onslaught of the Scandinavians, the English army began to buckle. Britnoth himself went down in a maelstrom of sword cuts and spear thrusts. As the Ealdorman's army disintegrated, a handful of thanes rallied to fight on. They threw themselves against the invaders with suicidal courage, and all were killed. In the wake of this English disaster, Ethelred was forced to buy peace from the Vikings. To save London that year, £10,000 of silver was handed over.
In the short term, paying the Vikings off was probably a good thing, because it meant that they would probably try their hand somewhere else. They surely would see that you didn't have the ability to gain vast sums of cash again in the short term, because the whole process of collecting this tribute must have taken some time. In the longer term, however, very clearly it signalled to the Vikings that you were prepared to give in, you were prepared to concede, and that if they hassled you again and again and again, that you would again give in, because this was a better thing for you to do than to fight them.
I think one of the things that's in Danegeld for the Anglo-Saxon and Frankish monarchs is that it allows you to tax your own populace, which is rather nice, because of course in early medieval Europe the man who taxes you is the man who's levying tribute on you. In other words, he's your enemy. Good lords are supposed to be laffords, loaf givers. They're supposed to give rings, they're supposed to give wealth. They're not supposed to tax you. Well, this enables you to tax your population, which is rather nice. And I think if you look at Anglo-Saxon monarchs, what they are doing is they are creaming off money from paying Danegeld. Okay, you have to levy the Danegeld on your population, but then part of that you have yourself and the rest you pay to the Danes.
King Ethelred was in an almost hopeless position. Not only was the external threat enormous, but his own thanes were capable of treachery to match the Vikings' own infighting. His impotence and the invaders' continually broken promises of good behaviour caused the king to lash out in 1002. On the eve of St. Brice's Day, Ethelred ordered that all Danes within his kingdom should be killed. The string of murders that followed, known as the St. Brice's Day Massacre, turned out to be one of Ethelred's biggest blunders. We shall never know how many Danes were killed, certainly nothing close to all within the kingdom, but Gunhild, wife of Palle, was amongst the dead. Her brother was enraged and determined to have his revenge upon the English. Her brother was the King of Denmark, Sven Forkbeard. The Danish attacks on England intensified the following year. In 1014, 20 years of battery culminated in the conquest of England by Sven's army. Ethelred fled to Normandy, and Sven was briefly recognised as King of England before he died of natural causes. Despite a brief revival in English fortunes under the leadership of Edmund Ironside, Sven's son, Knut, would go on to rule a fleeting empire that encompassed England, Denmark and Norway. Knut's marriage to Emma, the widow of Ethelred, paved the way for the return of the Anglo-Saxon dynasty in 1042. Edward the Confessor, who succeeded to the English throne in that year, was Ethelred's son and the stepson of Knut. The contested succession that followed his death in 1066 would be the Viking swan song. It was from France that the successful challenge would come, in the shape of William the Conqueror. William himself was the descendant of Danish Vikings, but it is Harald Hardrada who's often given the epithet of the last Viking. His title, Hardrada, meant hard ruler, and this fierce king of Norway in every way lived up to the classic image of the Viking.
Harald Hardrada was, in a sense, quite a minor figure in Norway as a politician. He was the half-brother of St. Olaf. In 1015 he supposedly left Norway after defeat in battle in which his half-brother had been killed. From there he goes south, he serves in armies in Eastern Europe, and then eventually he winds up in Byzantium and serves in the Varangian Guard.
Around 1045, so when he was about 30 years old, he headed back to Norway, where he dislodged his nephew Magnus from the Norwegian throne and ruled in Norway for 20 years. But I suppose the single most famous episode in his life was the Battle of Stamford Bridge.
In 1066, Hardrada left Norway to enforce his own spurious claim to the English throne. After winning a victory at Fulford against local forces, Hardrada was surprised by Harold Godwin's army racing up from the south. In the slaughter that followed at Stamford Bridge, it was the King of England's housecarls that would be decisive in the annihilation of the Viking army. professional soldiers introduced as the king's household troops by King Knut, they now fought to defend England from Norwegian Vikings. The King of Norway fell with most of his army, and the corpse-strewn wreckage of the battlefield marked the defeat of the last real Viking threat.
There are a couple of key things that have happened in Western Christendom by 1100 to make the Vikings less of a problem. The first is perhaps the most important, in that the Vikings have been brought within the fold. By 1100 they've been Christianized. By 1100 there are bishops in Scandinavia who are receiving letters from the popes who are part and parcel of Western Christendom. They are within rather than without.
On the one hand, the people who were defending themselves got better. Clearly fortifications were increased and improved across Western Europe over the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, and we start to see stone castles being built. And in some sense this may be related to the kind of raiding on the scale that we see with the Vikings. On the other hand, the Vikings actually get what they want. People from Scandinavia actually become kings of England, for example. They become rulers of Normandy. So the people with the most wealth and the most power have actually been successful by this stage.
The image of the Viking has traditionally been that of the bloodthirsty pagan, looting, raping and murdering almost for his own amusement. Clearly, the Vikings were men capable of tremendous acts of violence. But the Viking era was not the Holocaust that has sometimes been represented. And their most enduring legacies were to result from their accomplishments as seafarers, merchants and artists.